at the National Press Club, Prime Minister Paul Keating and the political and economic landscape. It's the Prime Minister's first Press Club appearance since April last year, when he presented Working Nation. We take you now to the National Press Club in Canberra.
Welcome to the National Press Club, ladies and gentlemen. We're very pleased to welcome back again the Prime Minister for today's National Press Club Telstra address. It wouldn't have escaped the notice of anyone interested in the system of governance and public policy in Australia that Parliament resumed this week and the political season's in full swing. The Prime Minister needs no further introduction to an audience like this, so I invite you to welcome the Prime Minister, Paul Keating.
Thank you very much, Ken. I'm very pleased to be back. You may have picked up a comment the other day to the effect that Australian politics was becoming risk-averse, even gutless. And you'll understand my outrage at this slur upon my profession. Or at least upon those of us in the government. Keen to defend its reputation, a couple of lively issues notwithstanding, I decided to come to the Press Club and deliver a speech. Not one of those headland speeches you've been hearing. Being decidedly non-risk averse, I'm more inclined to the headlong speech. Or to put it another way, I'd like to share with you some thoughts on where the country is going, what's good and what needs to be improved, how we might retain the good and make the improvements. There are several places I could start, with those economic data in the back page of The Economist, for instance, where Australia continues to outshine many of our OECD counterparts in economic fundamentals and is placed among the top brigade in forecasts for growth. It's easy, of course, to take comfort from the data, notwithstanding the current account deficit, which we must and will correct. The data shows that Australia is doing very well, and we should draw satisfaction from that. Our initiatives have generally been effective. We've got the economic settings pretty well right, and our approach to the economic and social equation has been, I think, largely vindicated. But to draw a sense of satisfaction is not the same as drawing a sense of complacency. If I've learned one big thing in the past decade is that reform never stops. You never entirely get out of the woods. There's always one more thing, or two, or three, or even four more things. You never really get to the last chapter. You might sometimes imagine that you're approaching it and that you'll get over the next hill and you'll see emblazoned in a clear blue sky the words, "The End." But of course, it only happens in the movies. It doesn't happen in government. I set up in Roma the other day. It's a bit like farming. You fix the tractor and the generator goes on the blink. You get through a drought and you have to deal with a flood. And I suppose sometimes it simply boils down to endurance. The modern economic contest is a long-distance race, a very long-distance race. It's like the modern marathon, it gets faster and faster, but unlike the marathon, it's got no finish line. I agree most wholeheartedly with what John Prescott had to say on Tuesday. In some respects, I wish I didn't. I wish I could say all the reform was over and that we don't need to change any more, but of course we do. We need the culture of continuous initiative, which John Prescott talked about. We need it in government, in our education system, our public service, and in our businesses. It's a condition of success in the modern world. But we should remember that it's also a measure of our success. The reason we have to go on is that we've come this far already. Far enough to be a player, far enough to enjoy some of the rewards and get within view of the greater ones, far enough to know our potential and our strengths and our weaknesses. I mentioned marathons. I think there's a lesson to be learned from watching marathons and listening to former marathon runners. They all talk about not losing rhythm. Up hills and down, over cobblestones, round corners, through the pain, through the drink stations. You have to keep the same steady stride and keep your eyes fixed. You have to keep mind and body and soul together. When they are together, keeping up is almost mechanical. When they begin to fall apart, the consequences are, as we know, rapid and dramatic. In no time you drop out of the leading pack and very few ever make up the ground again. I think it's something like the position we're in. On our own initiative, talents and hard work, we've joined the leaders, and we have to stay there. If they go faster, we have to go faster. We have to keep our stride. If we're to keep up, we need to continuously improve. If we are to continuously improve, we have to keep everything together. The basics which have got us thus far have to stay in tune. And by this rather circuitous route, I come back to the last time I spoke at the Press Club. You'll remember it was in connection with Working Nation, the government's white paper on employment, industry and regional development. I remember copying a bit of criticism from comparing it with the white paper of the 1940s. Some saw it as a shameful boast in their eyes, but I thought then and think now that it was more than a fair comparison. In fact, if only because contemporary Australia is a more complex place, Working Nation had to be a statement of broader dimensions and far greater detail than its counterpart of 50 years ago. And it was as much a defining document. It was as much a statement of this government's philosophy as the white paper of 1944 was to the governments of Reconstruction which Keating and Chifley led. I hope it will be as much a stamp of our ambition and achievement. Working Nation was about keeping mind and body and soul together. I think I said at the time that it was addressed the great issue of unemployment with a cool head and a warm heart. It addressed problems which were both specific to Australia and endemic in contemporary Western economies and societies. It addressed them with a view to maintaining the balance in this country between economic efficiency and social justice. Indeed, we sought the means to make these two goals complementary. As Australian policy had been right through the 80s, Working Nation was different to the orthodox model of economic liberalisation, the model adopted in a number of other countries and by our opponents. It took the view that we could be competitive and still look after those on the margins. We could compete with the best in the region and the world and yet maintain our egalitarian values and preserve our social cohesion. Working Nation was a document for its time, and it was a very good one, I believe. It's made life easier and opportunity greater for countless Australians. It will make Australia both more productive and fairer. It will help preserve the fabric of our communities and our families. It's serving hundreds of thousands of Australians now, and it'll still be serving them in a long time to come. Working Nation did not suddenly drop from the clouds. Its provenance was the whole period of reform from 1983. It addressed the imperatives facing us in the 1990s, yet it was part of a policy story which includes financial deregulation and tariff reform, reforms in training and education, the progressive introduction of a sophisticated social wage, the Accords, in summary, a policy record which reflects Australia's dual commitment to economic liberalisation and social fairness. Working Nation built on this story and the philosophy underlying it. It took a position on long-term unemployment which not everyone shared, but it was logical, moral and consistent with Australia's traditional values. For all these reasons, it will make Australia stronger. With Working Nation, we were not ahead of our time, but we were ahead of most other countries, among them the United States, where Robert Reich and many commentators these days complain of its destructive imbalance between economic and social goals. Working Nation now seems a long time ago, and you might ask why I'm reviving it today, particularly as one of the weekend columnists wrote that there's no value in these big policy statements anymore, no political value at least. But of course, Working Nation is still operating. It's out there in Australian communities now, and there is profound value in major policy statements, including political value. Policy is the means by which the lives of individuals, families and communities are shaped. It's the means by which we shape the character and the future of the nation. It's the purpose of political life, the only worthwhile measure of political success and by far the most significant measure of the worth of politicians and political parties. It's also the best way, I believe, to get elected. I remain in no doubt that however long they might suspend their judgment, Australians always make policy their principal measure. When they judge the government sometime next year, they will judge it on the basis of policy. Whatever you and the media or we the politicians think about our ability to read or influence their views, one way or another, the ultimate test Australians apply will be the policy test. It's essential to good democratic government that we explain our actions, that we listen to what people are thinking, that we understand what they are going through, and that we are prepared to adjust our strategies when the interests of the people demand it. But it's equally essential that we don't confuse the product with the marketing of it. Of course, we can be criticised for failing to sell policies as well as we might, as well as perhaps we could do. I've no doubt that the criticism's often justified. But don't tell me that what Australians want most in their lives or need most is another salesman. Don't tell me that's what they want in their Prime Ministers. We can also be criticised for not hearing the complaints of large numbers of Australians, and I think very often that criticism is justified too. But don't tell me that all Australians want from their government is a good listener. As I've said a few times, good governments listen, but so too do bad governments. In our political culture, I think we should resist what might well be a temptation to confuse good government with good radio and good television. They're not the same. The essence of good government is not in the listening or in the talking, but in the thinking and in the doing. It was not public relations or the spin doctors which caused total employment to rise by 380,000 in the year to June, or by a now almost unbelievable 680,000 since April 1993. Primarily it was policy. It was thinking and doing which produced those things. It was not PR which provided nearly 400,000 Australians with case-managed assistance to get employment or training, or a 20% fall in the number of long-term unemployed, or a fall of more than 25% among young long-term unemployed Australians. It was policy. Again, it was thinking and doing. When Working Nation was delivered, all of us here were in no doubt that what was the most important issue facing the country at that time, of course, it was unemployment. No one needed reminding about the devastating effect of unemployment on individuals, families and communities. None of our imaginations needed prompting when we thought about the difference between having a job and not having a job. We all knew that jobs are far and away the best means of distributing wealth and opportunity, that they are the best defence against alienation and delinquency, the best measure and the best source of family and community prosperity and cohesion, the best form of crime prevention, the best investment a government can make. Well, I don't think we've forgotten. Even though we've had unprecedented job growth and a fall in the unemployment rate amongst the highest in the OECD, I don't think we've decided that the problem has gone away. I think we still know that nothing counts as much as jobs, yet there has been a shift. There has been a shift. Not in those communities where unemployment is still very high, or in the families where breadwinners or children are still unemployed, nor among those administering programs or dealing with the consequences of unemployment. But in the places where opinion is made, jobs have dropped down a rung or two in the ladder of what matters, and I suggest they should stay on top. As long as jobs stay at the peak of our national ambitions, we will know that we are keeping body and soul together. We'll know that as a community we've kept faith with the spirit of change in the past decade, and indeed with what we think of as perhaps our national character and our core traditions. And that's the best way to succeed. The effort to marry economic efficiency to social justice and cohesion has been the means by which we've reached the leading group of nations. And you then have to ask, well, why change it? Why change it? If a consensual incomes policy, a partnership between the union movement and the government, is delivering progressive economic, social and industrial relations reform, if it is a vehicle of our progress, why would you ditch it in favour of a conflict model? Why change stride? If the Accords have helped substantially deliver sustained productivity increases since 1983, a 60% decrease in working days lost in strikes compared with the previous period, and in the last 12 months the lowest number of strikes since records were first collected in 1942, employment growth of 4.8% in the past year and 2.3% on average since 1983, economic growth, which at 3.7% is one of the highest in the OECD, an inflation rate currently less than 3%, why would you be ditching the Accord? Why, when the Accord has helped create the culture in which change can take place, in which the imperatives of competitiveness have been recognised, in which enterprise-based agreements are becoming the norm, and worker superannuation is laying the foundations of a national savings program, why would you ditch it? The essential contribution of the Accord has been an inflation mechanism, in which the union movement has delivered wage restraint to help ensure buoyant employment outcomes and through this sustained increases in household incomes. The effect has been an increase in per capita real disposable household income of 19.7% since 1983. I'll just repeat that amazing statistic. An increase in per capita, per person real disposable household income of 19.7% since 1983. Each employment target has been met. Underlying inflation has been reduced. And at the same time, Australia has been opened up to international trade and regional growth. And all of this without industrial disputes and without protection, and with protection for the most economically and socially vulnerable. Why, when you have an effective inflation mechanism in the form of the Accord, would you ditch it and leave yourself with only monetary policy to control prices? And what about this view? You keep the monarchy, but you ditch the Accord. An amazing perspective on contemporary Australia. If we accept that social cohesion and social justice are desirable ends in themselves, traditional national ambitions and essential aids to the economic progress we've been making, why would you be threatening cuts of between $5 and $10 billion in government outlays? Why would you? It's also reasonable to ask, why would you expect anyone to believe that cuts of this magnitude, why would you be foolish enough to expect anyone to believe that cuts of these magnitude will not include cuts in the major government programs of income support, support for the aged, support for young people, support for education, health and transport, amongst others? And why, when the evidence is plain that globalisation and new technology is tending to increase earnings inequality everywhere, would you compound the problems in Australia by cutting into the social wage we've built up over the past decade? In the United States, over the 1980s, 70% of the rise in average family incomes has gone to the top 1% of families. 70% of the rise in average family incomes has gone to the top 1% of families. In the same period, the average real income of the bottom 20% of income distribution has fallen by 10%. So the bottom 20 have actually gone backwards. In Australia, very substantial increases in income support, broadening the tax base, introducing fringe benefits and the capital gains tax, reducing the lowest marginal tax rate to 20%, and increasing the tax-free threshold have all mitigated the tendency towards unequal income distribution. As a result, the gap is nowhere near as wide in Australia as it is in the United States. At the same time, the introduction of Medicare, large increases in funded educational participation, the expansion of childcare, targeted public sector housing, and now improved income in retirement through superannuation, none of which are taken into account by the usual studies of international comparisons, all narrow the gap further in income distribution. If a sophisticated social safety net is keeping Australian society together through a period of profound and pervasive change, why would you tear holes in it? Why would you make the US labour market model Australia's model when the US Labor Secretary is lamenting its inadequacy? To fix the current account? To make an impact on our external debt? Because they're doing it in New Zealand? But in New Zealand, since they introduced individual contracts in 1991, productivity has increased by only 1% per annum. 1% per annum. In Australia, it's increased by over 2.5% per annum in the same period. No one in the government believes that every step we've taken has been the right step, any more than we believe that all our problems in the nation are behind us. We know that the figures indicating that Australia has moved beyond the realms of recovery into a sustained period of growth do not translate into ease and comfort for every household or every community. We know that the confidence in Australian share markets and among commentators like Chris Keating and Don Stammer are not generally felt around the country at the moment. Don Stammer has been reported as saying that he expected a long-lasting upswing that will take us through to at least the year 2000. The Australian said recently we may be experiencing, and I quoted, the healthiest recovery the nation has had. But we know that it does not feel that healthy in a lot of Australian homes. We know there's a lot of uncertainty around still, and that there are a lot of people preying on this uncertainty. Perhaps this is where we need that capacity for endurance that I mentioned. The government could do with it to deal with the modicum of frustration anyone feels when hard-won and long sought-after success is interpreted as something much less. Much more importantly, Australia's need it as we come to terms with an essentially new kind of Australian economy, an economy in which we have sustained growth without inflation, not a boom, not an environment in which we substitute inflation for savings, but low inflation, sustainable growth, low inflationary growth. The uncertainties which people feel are not unique to Australia, of course. In the United States and elsewhere, there appears to be wide concern about the income distribution gap, about frustrated personal aspirations and inadequate personal security. I've talked about the income gap in Australia, and I might add the observation that in Australia the rich are not yet building private roads for themselves or employing private police forces and establishing, for all intents and purposes, a new species of feudalism. They have not had a government in the past 10 years willing to encourage the growth of an exclusive and exclusivist oligarchy and an underclass condemned to permanent and increasing impoverishment. We've liberalised the economy to encourage opportunity and to create wealth, but we've also pursued a fair social equation and kept alive the sense of commonwealth. International comparisons create a context in which our problems can be better understood, but I know there is small comfort for real insecurities. Nevertheless, I think that with each successive quarter of growth, confidence will slowly return. We can also reasonably expect a steady improvement in confidence as the current account begins to improve. It'll take a while for the real and lasting benefits of reforms to superannuation to be appreciated, but they will be. And there is genuine reassurance for all Australians in them. They mean greater comfort and security in retirement, and they mean a savings base and, in due course, a savings culture for the nation. That sense that the recovery will be short-lived can only be laid to rest by time. The fears about the current account and our external debt will start to fade as the deficit declines and Australians become aware that solving the problem is within our reach, and of course it is. It's within our reach because of the action we've taken on both public and private savings. We've taken the decisions to restore the budget to surplus. As Treasury has shown, the changes to superannuation will lift private savings by around 4% of GDP over time. These initiatives mean less reliance on foreign borrowings, in fact considerably less. I would very much like to see develop a new phase in the economic consciousness of Australians. I know it's undergone a remarkable transformation in the past decade, but I'd like to see another one, and I think it will happen. Over the next 2 or 3 years, I believe Australians will not only recognise that we've entered a period of prolonged growth, but rapidly come to insist that we stay on this sustainable low inflation path. I believe we'll see a savings culture quickly emerge, and among the elements of that culture will be a recognition that we will only succeed by saving and investing wisely, making maximum sustainable use of our resources, continuing to work hard and committing ourselves to the path of continuous improvement. I think John Prescott can feel confident about Australia's capacity to reach what he calls champion status. The fact is, Australia's already embarked on a process of continuous improvement at a national level. There are a multitude of new, well-managed quality firms in Australia, which were born and have thrived because of the internationalisation of the Australian economy. They were raised in the knowledge that no matter how good they are today in their product and their processes, they will be better and will need to be better tomorrow. And the government is keeping pace. We know we have to both encourage innovation in the private sector and practice it ourselves. We also know that the public is understandably cynical when governments talk about their achievements and their work practices, but we have to keep up the pace of reform and maintain it. This year we negotiated the 8th Accord. Each accord has been built on the preceding one. Each one has been designed to meet contemporary needs. We've maintained the progress in opening Australia to international and regional economies and improving those environments for trade. From those first initial reforms, financial reforms a long time ago, through the tariff reductions of the late 80s, APEC and the vision of free trade in the Asia Pacific, we've kept up the pace. We've progressed from protectionism and industry assistance through the adjustment plans for particular industry sectors we have today, to the notions of innovation, investment facilitation and seeding growth through assistance to small and medium-sized enterprises which govern our modern industry policy. Above all, we're developing the skills of our people, which is the foundation of any successful industry or industry policy. One Nation was a great leap forward, have no doubt about that. Working Nation, and to no small extent the Cultural Policy Creative Nation, consolidated those gains. The statement on innovation industry that we'll deliver later this year will maintain the pace. We'll continue to back our judgment. We'll continue to follow an Australian path to international success. We take the view that government needs to be put out a marker beyond the current best practice, so we're not simply playing catch-up. It's a rare government that meets with total private sector approval, and we don't go seeking it. But we do seek partnerships, common goals, a cooperative spirit. We talk to business a great deal. We're constantly exchanging ideas. But governments have independent roles and capacities. If they do their job diligently and with a passion and have no hang-ups about their role, they can help industry build its competitiveness, they can help it enter international marketplaces, they can help it win. Our worst critics will concede that this government has done a great deal to translate regional free trade from economic fantasy into a real political prospect. I think industries therefore have reason to feel confident that we count their interests as we count our own, which is to say, as part of the national interest. I began by talking about policy and I'll end by it. I don't mean I'll give you the full checklist since 1983, I won't even give you a resume since 1992. But I want to say this much. The big policy statements, those big non-risk averse statements from One Nation through to this year's budget, have at their heart something more than meeting the interests of the sectors of the economy and population which they specifically address. I think there's more to them than the effect they've had in, say, kick-starting the economy and creating new national infrastructure as One Nation did, or creating a stimulus for regional development as Working Nation did, or a new deal for Australia's creative artists and industries as the cultural statements did. I think beyond the practical effects we seek from them, good policy developments pick up on forces at work within the country. I mean things as intangible as collective needs and ambitions, emerging ideas and perspectives, and they give them concrete force, they give them expression in the real life of the country, and the life of the nation should be healthier for it. I see policy as a process of national reinvigoration and reinvention. I see it as a process of national character building. Among the many things One Nation did, I hope, was to give expression to the sentiment that there is always there in hard times that fellow feeling, the sense that we are stronger when we stick together. And insofar as it succeeded in doing this, I hope the feeling will last us right through the decade. Working Nation, I believe, gave expression to an Australian sensibility as old as the nation itself, that employment is a birthright and the unemployed should not be left behind. That this is a fair country and properly a pioneer of social democracy. I hope Creative Nation will prove to have tapped a vein of creativity and national pride, that the Native Title Act will be seen in time as an expression not for our collective guilt, but our collective sense of justice and responsibility, and that before the end of the century, the initiative that we have taken with the Republic will give voice to an Australian spirit and a full Australian identity. John Prescott said on Tuesday night, "A country must be able to constantly renew itself if it's to offer its people rising standards of living and larger opportunities." He said he wanted a culture of continuous initiative. I've never welcomed a speech by an Australian business leader more than this one, especially after all the talk about risk averseness. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Prime Minister. As usual, we move on to our period of media questions. You would not be surprised to know that there was a very heavy demand for the opportunity to ask questions today. What we've mutually agreed is that at least for the first round of questions, there'll be one from each of the major organisations, and for that reason I probably won't know until they stand up who the person is, but the first one I know is from Tony Wright.
Tony Wright from the Sydney Morning Herald. Prime Minister, is it still your view, as you stated a few weeks ago, that the West Australian Royal Commission doesn't matter a tinker's cuss? Will the government continue to try to ignore the fallout from that Royal Commission, and would it ignore a finding that Dr Carmen Lawrence lied about her role in the Penny Easton affair?
Well, the Liberal Party have got Carmen Lawrence on trial for the suicide of Penny Easton. That's what's on here. You know what's on. It's unjust and it's immoral, and we're not going to be any part of it.
Prime Minister, Jenny Hewitt from the Financial Review. Do you think it's politically acceptable for a minister to lie? Is there a question of morality or ethics involved, or is it what you can get away with politically?
I hope probity in public life and integrity in public life are the stock of the core things about public life. And as I've just said to you, all honesty and integrity in politics starts with policy, not tricky, slick statements by politicians at doorstops. But if the imputation in your question is that Carmen Lawrence is untruthful or has lied, you've prejudged her and not even given her the opportunity, unfairly of you, to put her view.
Lenore Taylor.
Lenore Taylor from the Australian newspaper. You spoke in your speech a lot about marketing and products. John Howard has been outpolling you by and large in recent months, even without a product. How do you explain that? Why don't you think the voters are focusing on the product and they seem to be agreeing with his marketing even without policies released yet?
Well, I don't think you should jump to conclusions about the polls. I honestly think they vote on policy. The government's won 5 successive elections. We've won them all basically on policy. We won 1984 after our first election on the huge changes to economic policy between 83 and the end of 84. We won in 1987 because we were responding to the worst terms of trade Australia had enjoyed since the Great Depression. A huge change to fiscal policy, a huge reorientation of national savings. That's why we won. We won with the May Statement of 1987, and 2 months later we won an election with it. We won in 1990 because we'd given Australians the growth phase in the employment that we'd promised them. We trebled the rate of employment growth that the Coalition was able to provide over its 7 years of office. We won in 1993 because of the changes I've mentioned. One nation, restarting the commitment I gave as Prime Minister to restart growth and employment. We won because of the commitment to those age-old Australian values of egalitarianism and fairness. We won because we had a view of Australia which was the view of the enlargers of Australia and not the straighteners and punishers. And we'll win next time because the Labor Party alone has the capacity to change Australia inexorably, to give it a long-run, low-inflation period of growth, to see it adopt a productivity culture, a savings culture, and to give it a place in the Asia-Pacific the Liberals could have not even conceived of. They're the things that win elections, and while no doubt the public always like to think they've got a choice in their opposing party's leadership, particularly after the disappointment of Mr Downer and the then rush, if you like, the lift and the buoyancy of the poll support which Mr Howard's got, it's gradually coming off, and it'll come off most obviously on election day.
Ian Davis.
Ian Davis from the Canberra Times, Prime Minister. The Reserve Bank said in its annual report yesterday that despite improvements in public and household savings, Australia still needs to improve its savings performance if living standards are to improve. Does the government accept that it needs to go further in improving national savings? Is renewed tax reform part of this necessary equation?
No, I don't think so. I think what the bank was referring to was a need to cut back on such things as double dipping and superannuation through the need for tighter preservation rules and access to lump sums, these sorts of things. Over time, of course, with the remedial changes we have in place, the grandfathering provisions from the pre-83 changes, those are in place. I need to continue to deliver on the budget balance. That means we'll have a budget balance in place, as the Reserve Bank report notes, but need to keep it there, and that's a message not only to the government but to the opposition and the Senate. I think the need for the Senate to support the government's fiscal tightening strategy, I think that's another very clear imputation or implication of the report. I've already mentioned in the speech that superannuation is going to be worth about 4% of GDP in savings. The budget balance has already shifted in the next will have shifted from last year to the next 2 years by about 4% of GDP. That's 8%. All right, it's in an upcycle. Knock one or two out of it if you like, for an underlying number, and we're looking at a 6 percentage point savings change to deal with what? A 1.5 percentage point problem. We've had the current account deficit running at about 4.5% of GDP. It's stable at about 3 or just under. So we've got a 6 percentage point fix in for a 1.5 percentage point problem. I think the Governor and the Bank are right to say to the nation and to say to the political system, keep your eye on the public sector and also keep your eye on the big change in occupational superannuation.
Alan Sunderland.
Alan Sunderland, SBS Television. Mr Keating, you've said that the next election will be one on policy. Do you think that your government needs to come out with a major new policy statement, an economic statement or some sort of other big picture, non-risk averse package before the next campaign, or do you think you will fight and win the next election essentially on the sort of policy mix you've outlined?
Well, it's hard to get the signals from you. So telling me big statements don't work and then you're saying maybe we need one. This has been the government of change in the post-war years. From 1983 to now, we've changed Australia to make it an internationally competitive country. Look at those numbers we mentioned. We're 40% more competitive today than we were in 1983. Not 40. We've had a 40% increase in household disposable income in the period. We've had a 20% increase in household income per capita. We've seen exports grow from 13% of GDP to 22% of GDP. We've seen over 2 million jobs created. We've seen 680,000 jobs in 2.5 years. It took us from 1788 to 1983 to get to 6 million, and we've added over 10% of that in 2.5 years. We've created a complete culture of change in productivity in the country, a change of attitude in the industrial workplace on the part of unions, on the part of managers, of businesses. We found ourselves a place in Asia that Australia of the past had never had before. it's come from a Labor government, and we'll keep on doing it. Now, having pulled the sock inside out, I don't know whether you want me to pull it back the other way. That can happen, of course. We can go to sleep again. We can put the tariff all up. We can run the flag up and ask people what they think about higher tariffs. If they don't like it, run it down slightly again. You know, we can hang on to the monarchy. We can do the Native Title Act in. We can refuse to talk to the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party, even though the US Secretary of State's quite happy to speak with him. We can turn our back on the region and we can go back to sleep. We can do all that by electing John Howard.
Glenn Milne.
Glenn Milne from the Seven Network, Prime Minister. You accused, I'm not sure whether it was us before or the opposition, of prejudging Carmen Lawrence by suggesting that she should have her day before the Royal Commission. Does this mean that you are effectively suspending judgment on her version of events until she testifies, or do you believe that Carmen Lawrence is telling the truth?
I can always rely on you to keep on the main game, Glenn. There's only one clear message here. The Liberal Party have Carmen Lawrence on trial for the suicide of Penny Easton. That's what it's about. And that can't be made to stick. I noticed just a day or so ago, we had a reference from her chief, a person who's been her chief accuser, in a sense, within the former government, or if not chief accuser, one of them, her former deputy. He said, I couldn't pin down any direct relationship between the death of Penny Easton and the petition. No one will ever be able to do that. Her mother, Barbara Campbell, went on to say these things. What about the suicide note, Mrs Campbell? The questioner says. The section's been published in the media refers to the petition about the petition, but there was more to it, I gather. Does that offer any clues to a suicide? Oh yes, it offers an awful lot, says Mrs Campbell. What other clues beyond the petition? Oh yes, definitely. Definitely. I mean the background, a family court. She mentioned the family court needed to be looked at. I mean, you know, there is also the case that we were all accused falsely of committing perjury in the family court, that these are issues to be looked at. Beyond the petition itself, yes, definitely. I mean, there was bankruptcy proceedings and all sorts of things. She was still there when she died. There was a High Court hearing still to be had on who had precedence, the bankruptcy court or the family court. So her life had become very confused, says the questioner. Lots of things apparently going wrong, things drawn out, she felt brought this all about. So the petition was just one factor. Mrs Campbell, yes, definitely. Now, we've had the Liberal Party, under Mr Howard's leadership, yesterday accusing her of Penny Easton's suicide. No such link, I think, can be made. If the petition has no link, established link to her suicide, what is the point of the Royal Commission? What is the relevance of it at all? At all. Other than who said what to whom in a former cabinet 3 years ago. And that's why, in the end, if people want to go chasing down motives for the death of people, we have processes, we have coroner's inquiries, and then we have the courts. But these things can't be resolved in a Royal Commission, which are not even looking at, on the expression of the Royal Commissioner, the actual suicide or the motives for it itself. So what, therefore, is the relevance of the inquiry?
Next question, I think, is from Nikki Sava.
Nikki Sava from the Herald Sun. Mr Keating. Would you as leader tolerate the tabling of a petition containing details of a family court matter in order to embarrass a political opponent?
Well, the answer is I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't, any more than I would let MPs in my party stand under the privilege of Parliament and accuse somebody of being principally at blame for the suicide of somebody, as John Howard did yesterday. But can I just say to you, that on that theme, I think that I don't think I would agree either that Mr Lightfoot, who among the first who raised this in the Western Australian Parliament, who said this: "Is the Premier aware that 2 passports of Mr Brian Easton, the Commissioner of Western Australian Public Service, have been confiscated by the Federal Court? Has Mr Easton sustained his resignation? If so, on what date did he resign? Is he to receive an ex gratia or severance payment exceeding normal public service regulated payments?" And he goes on. And the answer says this: "I'm asking you for confirmation." The then Premier says, "I know Mr Easton is passing through some marital problems at the present time, and I suppose that's another story. But it may have something to do with that. I hesitate to say that because I do not know. I have no doubt that if he will not provide the identity of the MP will not provide the identity of the avenue through which the information is coming, it'll be disclosed in the next week or so. I wouldn't approve that either." Could I also say that I endorse the then sentiments of the then Speaker, who said this: "I refer members to certain questions without notice which were asked by the member for Murchison Eyre on Tuesday of this week. It's been suggested those questions were based on information concerning proceedings before the family court. The least of this information may well have been unlawful. The point that does concern me, however, is whether the privilege of the freedom of the House might be being used to circumvent an explicit order of a court or a written law of this country. Obviously, it makes a mockery of observing a sub judice convention if the House tolerates or encourages speeches or questions aimed at subverting an order or rule given in an appropriate court. Likewise, this Parliament should not permit its privileges to be used to circumvent the written law of the Commonwealth aimed at protecting the personal privacy of citizens." That's in response to a number of issues related to this marital separation and difficulty made by members of the Liberal Party, beginning with Richard Court. I wouldn't approve of those either. But hence Mr Easton's petition and the tabling of it, which refers to some of these matters about what money he was to receive. How can you take the view with any justice that in some way all of the burden of the pressure of this issue has come via that petition, and then take the further view that it came at the behest of Carmen Lawrence? I mean, the Liberal Party started using family court material in the Western Australian Parliament. The beginner was Richard Court, followed consistently by a number of MPs, and they were rebuked by the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. And even after the petition, I think, was lodged, or about the same time, in 1989, there was a further reference by one of the MPs in the Legislative Council, Mr Masters, on the 9th of May 1989, which former employees of the West Australian Development Corporation, XM Corp, received a payment from the government or XM following their employment with WADC or XM for services rendered to either a subsidiary or some other government department. If you read the petition from Mr Easton, it refers to these matters. I mean, the Liberal Party were in this right up to their neck. I mean, where have you been living, Nicky? Under a rock? Don't you read?
The next question's from Randall Markey.
Randall Markey from the West Australian Prime Minister. Earlier...
it's such a high-tone publication.
Earlier, in an answer to a question, you were saying it would be unfair to to prejudge Carmen Lawrence and deny her the opportunity to put her side of her story to the Royal Commission. Doesn't it say that it must flow from that you will accept and abide by the findings of that Royal Commission? Otherwise, if not, the government is contradicting itself. Because on the one hand, you're saying that Dr Lawrence deserves her day in court to put her side of the case. Well, it's not, and on the other, you're saying that you will not commit yourself
to... Let me correct the question. It's not a court.
To abide by its findings.
It's not her day in court. It's not a court. It's not
Yes,
her
I
day in
understand
court.
that. So her day in the Commission then?
The Commission, the relevance of the reference to the Commissioner, if Penny Easton had not committed suicide, there would of course be no inquiry. And yet the Commissioner made very clear indeed, that he was not about, and his terms of reference were not about any inquiry into the motives or circumstances of Penny Easton's suicide. So therefore, in both real and political terms, the terms of reference lack all relativity to the event and therefore lack political relativity.
Next question is from Tony Vermeer.
Vermeer from AAP, Prime Minister. The Reserve Bank yesterday warned about the dangers that inflation may be on the march again, and you said after the budget that the budget had taken the pressure off interest rates. Do you now acknowledge that the pressure is back on, and can your government win an election with interest rates higher than they are now?
I don't think you can conclude from the report at all that the pressure's back on. In fact, I think the last line of the report, if I can go to it, says the balancing of these and other risks for activity and prices will be the key focus for monetary policy over the coming year. In the bank's judgment, policy is presently well positioned to respond as necessary to the evolving economic situation. Is presently well positioned. So you can't adduce from that the imputation I think you were making there. He makes the board the bank make a couple of other points. It says the incorporation of the 2 to 3% inflation objective into the Accord Mark 8 agreement, which is a very welcome endorsement of that objective, should be helpful in this regard. That's holding inflation. There are any number of references of that kind, and of course, you know, on some other general points, some references to, very strong references to the public sector saving, a reference to a change in the trend of dissaving by private individuals. I mean, there's not much in the report the government wouldn't endorse.
Bruce Jeffrey.
Prime Minister Bruce Jeffrey, three answers there. Prime Minister, I'd like to get back to your speech, if you may, and I'd like to get back to your speech, and more particularly to, in fact, a couple of omissions from it. You went through many of the achievements of the government. You didn't mention the efforts the government has made to transform higher education from an elite to a mass system, and your own initiatives, which come out in the last couple of years to add to that dimension through technical and further education. As you'll appreciate, although a lot more money has gone into higher education in particular over the years, there are people who would argue, like the Vice-Chancellor's Committee, that...
Tip it towards you. Point it towards your mouth.
I see, right there. Talking to the top of it, all right, okay. That the Vice-Chancellors and others have argued that, okay, you've said you can take so many more students, but then you haven't given them enough money for this, that the challenge the clever country is being fallen short of because you're not providing for research infrastructure and lots of other things they complain about, which I won't go through now, we haven't got all afternoon. Is there any chance of an improvement in or rejigging of a lot of technical and further education and higher education between now and the election, in the next election?
An improvement and
in the lot of higher education and so forth. What is going to happen in the innovation statement which will affect impact on higher education?
Okay. Well,
and technical and further.
Okay. Well, look. Let me approach the issue this way. You know that about 40% of the completions in secondary education, 40% of those students have gone through to higher education. That's been the pattern in Australia, roughly. But of course, when the completions were a small number, it meant that higher education was a relatively elitist thing. What the government has done is to improve the access and therefore the equity of education, is to get those completions up. and we now have them to around 8 in 10 students. They were 3.5, I think, from memory, in 10 in 1983. So it's a revolution in participation in education. But we have kept up the 40%, largely throughput, by adding places to higher education. We've added, I think, just on 275,000 places. We had 350,000 people in higher education in the early 80s. We've now got just on 600,000. We've created the equivalent of about 20 universities of a campus size the same as Sydney or Melbourne University. So it is a huge change. One of the things that pleases me greatly is there's an increased participation by women, young women, in both secondary education and higher education. But the other thing, of course, we had in One Nation was the Australian National Training Authority, the renaissance of technical and further education, building a national TAFE system to sit beside the universities. Because this has always been the Cinderella of Australian education. That is, for the 60% who did not gain access to higher education, they cascaded into a system without training. And basically what we're doing now is rapidly growing the TAFE system to pick those people up. And in fact, we had more people apply for entry into TAFE last year than we had apply for higher education, because there is often closer job prospects and job relevance and a closer profile with the labour market with vocational education than is the case with higher education. So we're hoping to have two mature, competent systems. And of course in this we've had generous payments for students. HEX has revolutionised participation in university. Every HEX dollar goes back into places. Every HEX dollar goes back into places. And as a consequence, I think our education policies remain now the foundation of the modern Australian society and industry, of our thrust into Asia, of our future.
Sid Marr.
Mr Keating, Sid Marr from the Courier Mail newspaper. Just with the election approaching, I just wonder if you're guaranteeing sort of acts of God, with notwithstanding, whether you'll stay around for the full term of the next Parliament if you're re-elected.
I'll see you off the course, I'll say. If we could have a slow time frame cameras of these tables and this lectern, you'd see me ageing gracefully and most of you disappearing.
Malcolm.
Prime Minister, Malcolm Farr from the Telegraph Mirror. Back to interest rates and your appeal for endurance from voters. The low inflation recovery is restricting the capital gain that many homeowners can expect on their property, and many of those homeowners are mortgage holders. But there's no equal and opposite reaction from low inflation in terms of interest rates. In fact, people are paying something like more than 3 times underlying interest rates for their mortgages. How long do you expect them to endure that? And as you were asked before, do you think you can go to an election with that situation still in place?
Well, Malcolm, I think if you draw a line through, let's say, the property market, which has probably put on more value over time than any, that's the Sydney property market, and you take it over 20 years, I'd be surprised if it does much more than keep pace with inflation. I'm sure you'll see a great shift in values at 2 or 3 years, every 6 or 7 years, and then it stops. It drops, and then it levels back out. So I don't know whether people beat inflation anyway. That's the first thing. The second thing is, during the periods of high inflation, the housing interest rates have been much higher than what they are now. We've got housing interest rates roughly around 10%. Some are lower, of course. But they were 15 or 16%, some higher. And of course, in the days when you had cocktail loans, you had some of them even greater again. You'd have X% at 14 or 15%, and then you'd have a lump at 20%. So there's been a big increase in disposable income coming off those falls in interest rates over the last few years. And you know, as the sustenance of low inflation becomes obvious and endemic to Australia, the whole view of the capital markets, both here and abroad, start to change about the premium the nation pays for its savings. So you're getting up with a better result. In other words, a lower risk premium, if you like. And so I think, but the other thing, I think most Australians also care about their children, about what happens to their housing. I think it's a big issue with people. And the system we had of high inflation was building mortgages and values for them that essentially enslaved them for all their working life. You know, trying to buy their first home in the prospects of sort of ever-increasing housing prices. Affordability, we've seen very stark increases in affordability in the last couple of years, and I think this is a very good social trend. It's not a bad social trend, it's an unambiguously good social trend. But I just also see, I think it was in the Herald today, that someone in the real estate sector saying median property prices in Sydney are lifting. I mean, these things will go on. But whether over time, if you wash the inflation out and they wash the inflation through, they do better than inflation, I don't know. But the point is having a roof over your head, not having a lump of inflation over your head, because that ends up meaning having an inflationary mortgage over your head. So I think low inflation is an unambiguously good thing for Australia. It'll give us higher real incomes, higher employment, and a higher standard of living than we've ever been able to obtain during the periods of high inflation.
John Ferguson.
John Ferguson from the Adelaide Advertiser, Prime Minister. Did Sir William Dean's views on the Republic influence your decision to back his appointment, and was the issue discussed at that meeting prior to his appointment?
I've never discussed the Republic with him, not ever. We've never discussed it.
Alison Carabine.
Prime Minister, Alison Carabine from Radio 2UE. There's probably little doubt that the Penny Easton affair has caused problems for the government. What's your assessment of the damage? And secondly, did you encourage Carmen Lawrence to bring forward her appearance before the Royal Commission to try and limit that damage?
Well, I think she takes the view I think her appearance for the Commission can be answered this way. She takes the view there's a sequence about her appearance, and that it's fairly difficult to ask of her to appear, to rely on information that basically should be provided in the first instance by the petitioner, by the person who presented the petition, and the clerk of the upper house who drafted it. Now, one would think that's a logical starting point for such an inquiry. And not unreasonably, I think she wants to follow those people through the inquiry, relying upon not what she knows and hearsay, but the actual evidence they provide.
And our next question will have to be our last today. It's from Paul Bongiorno.
Paul Bongiorno, Network 10, Prime Minister. While I accept that the Eastern Royal Commission has all the appearances of a political witch hunt, which is given potency by the death of Penny Easton, isn't the problem for you and your government, and I would suggest the dynamite for Carmen Lawrence, is that at this point of time, 8 of her former colleagues contradict her recollection, so that on the balance of probabilities, for fair-minded people looking at it, Carmen Lawrence's credibility is in tatters.
What was the word you used? I can't remember. The 8 recollection. Yes, but a recollection about what?
About when a cabinet meeting was held and what was discussed at it.
But the outcome of which was what?
The outcome was that I think it was about 5 days later.
No, the outcome wasn't.
The outcome
established link to the suicide of Penny Easton.
Now, I accept that.
Right, if you accept that, well, let me answer from there. If you accept that,
then... But Carmen Lawrence told the Parliament 3 days later something different.
Once you accept that, you must accept the next point, the logical point of that the discussion doesn't have a causal connection or relevance to the suicide. And once you accept that, it's basically a set of recollections by people about a cabinet meeting that has, in the broad politic, no particular relevance, and where honest people have different recollections, and where The person herself has not yet had the opportunity to put a view.
Prime Minister, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a varied hour, and I hope that if you'd had a pair of these for each time you'd been here, you'd been able to use them on an official entertaining scale. But these are a start. I'm sure there'll be plenty of occasions to celebrate. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed.